Right, so what I'd like to talk about is a method for producing free energy in abundant amounts for a relatively cheap price. And that sounds a bit like the answer to a dream, and like I'm just about to go into some really bizarre thing and scare everybody witless. And to a certain extent I probably will, because the method that I'm going to suggest, partly in the popular consciousness, is seen as dangerous. Now, it isn't. And please bear with it and listen all the way through, pick up the information, and you'll realise that what I'm talking about isn't the least bit dangerous. It's actually very realisable. It's being worked on at the moment. The technology is pretty much there. There's a few wrinkles to work out, but it's essentially there. It just needs developing, really. And the lack of development has been really the responsibility of alternative competing methods and a reluctance to put money into it. Now, I should warn you that the video is going to be pretty long, because there's a lot of information there and there's a lot to talk about and there's a lot to pass over to you. And I'm not sure really the level at which you're at when you're listening to this, so I kind of have to try and gauge that and hopefully not make it too stupid and simplistic, and yet not too complicated and boring, but with enough information that should you want to progress it, then you can progress it all by yourself if you want. So that's always a challenging thing to do, and what it means really is it takes time. So I apologise for the length, I apologise for the wordiness, but I think it's a very interesting subject and very worthwhile, and one of those things that's really going to be good to pursue, because it's one of those things we could actually realise very, very quickly. Now, what I'm going to talk about is actually nuclear energy. And of course, the minute you say nuclear energy, people immediately think of the latest disaster in Japan, 3 Mile Island, that kind of thing. And that's not unreasonable, because the current way that we use nuclear energy is actually basically cumbersome. It's almost archaic in the way that we use it and the way we manipulate it. We manipulate it really in the same way that we used to look at steam engines, and we do the same kind of thing. We use this nuclear energy to heat up a working fluid, steam, and we use that steam to drive a turbine. And it produces an awful lot of waste, and that waste is dangerous. It's hard to get rid of, and if it does go wrong, it goes spectacularly wrong. But the kind of nuclear energy I'm talking about is different to the kind of nuclear energy that we currently use. Now, the kind of nuclear energy we currently use, I'm sure everybody knows, is nuclear fission. And nuclear fission is where you take a nucleus and you split it apart, and it'll do that pretty much by itself if it's big enough, and you're talking about uraniums here. You split it apart, and that splitting apart forms new elements and an awful lot of heat, and that heat is captured in heating the working fluid, and these new elements are radioactive in themselves. And of course, once that initial nuclear fuel is spent, the spent fuel is what really costs so much to get rid of, because a lot of this stuff stays radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. And what do you do with it? Well, what they currently do with it, of course, is bury it at sea in great big containers. They put it into oil barrels, fill that with cement, and chuck it overboard. It's what they used to do. And what they're doing at the moment is they're digging big holes, and they're carrying these containers down and hiding it underground. It's really, really bizarre, but that's what they do. And the other problem with them, of course, is the reaction products from splitting this nucleus apart creates an awful lot of harmful radiation, and that harmful radiation will hit the internal of the machine that you're doing it in, and it damages the machine. It transmutates the internals, it causes them to be radioactive. They have quite a relatively short lifespan, and then you're left with these tons of concrete and steel and all kinds of stuff that you then got to get rid of. So it's a horrendous technology, really, in terms of the environment, truly horrendous. But luckily, there's another kind of nuclear energy that you can harness, and we all, again, know about this, and this is nuclear fusion. And nuclear fusion is, as you know, the process which keeps the sun alive. If we take two light nuclei and force them together, it'll produce an awful lot of energy and a new element, and that energy can then be captured. And this goes on day in, day out, a few 100 million miles away in the sun. That's what we do. Now, when we first approached nuclear fusion, what we looked at is the thing that was just in front of us, the sun, and we tried to reproduce the same conditions in order to reproduce the same effect. And the conditions of the sun are obviously tremendous heat, tremendous pressure, quite high velocities and huge densities. And if we can get those things to work, then yeah, sure, we can get nuclear fusion to work. Now, the reason it works in the sun, of course, is because the sun's just so big, it's so massive that the gravitational force on those nuclei keep them in close proximity to each other. The actual incipient heat isn't released easily because the thing's just so big, it can't get out there. I mean, we get a lot of heat from it, but that's nothing compared to what's actually in there. So the whole reaction system of the sun is ideal for these kind of reactions to occur. In order to produce that back down on Earth, of course, we have somewhat challenging problems. And the traditional way of looking at it has been to look at it in the hot plasma kind of way. So we need to create this or recreate this sun-like environment here. And we've tried to do that. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that hot plasmas are immensely corrosive. If you touch anything, they're just destroyed immediately. So what you need to do is confine those plasmas to an area where they can't touch anything. And the way that they've actually been confining them is using a device called a tokamak. Now, a tokamak is a huge thing. It's bigger than an aircraft carrier. It's just massive. And most of the bulk of it is made up of magnets because they use magnetic confinement. They flip on the switch, on come these super powerful magnets, and they squeeze the plasma into an area where it doesn't touch anything and hold it there, hoping that the reaction will happen. And there's a big problem with this because when nuclei fuse, they gain energy and they're able to jump the magnetic field lines. And as they do this, it only takes about 3 or 4 jumps until they touch the wall of the tokamak. And of course, that destroys it. So after about sort of 45 years and a couple of $100 billion research on this thing, they've managed to produce a tokamak that will produce enough energy to maybe run a toothbrush. That's about it. So it's not really impressive. And they're continuing on this line because obviously billions of dollars have been spent on this and there's a huge vested interest in it. So they continue to push down this line of magnetic confinement. Now, in order to get a nuclear reaction to happen, what you really need to do is essentially very simple. You need to get enough of the reactants together with sufficient density, and you need to fire them at each other in the correct angle with a sufficient force. Because, of course, a nucleus, so we take something like hydrogen, which is essentially just a proton. Then a nucleus has a force of repulsion. These are two positive charges. So if we fire them at each other, they can only get so close until these positive charges will repel away from each other. And that repulsion is called the Coulomb force. And in order to get them to fuse so that we get our helium, we need to overcome that Coulomb force. And when we can overcome the Coulomb force, the nuclear interactions will hold them together as helium. But we have to overcome this, and that's a problem. Now, the reason you have to fire them at directly at each other is if you fire them slightly off centre, what they'll do is just bounce off. And it doesn't matter how fast you fire them, if they're at the wrong angle, they'll bounce off and it's a waste of energy. So we're looking at some system really that has to satisfy these conditions. So N1 and N2, they're the densities of the reactant species that you're using. So if we use something like heavy hydrogen deuterium, then that would actually just be N squared. If we use different species, then it's obviously M1, N2 for the densities of the species that you're using. Now this sigma F is the cross-sectional area. So it's basically, if I take a slice out of it, and I have an awful lot of these things at specific density, and I can increase that density for the same cross-sectional area, I'm going to increase the likelihood of them hitting each other. It's a simple thing. If you chuck a load of marbles on the floor and there's a lot of them together and you throw in another marble, your likelihood of hitting a marble is that much bigger. If you have the same area, one marble in it, and you randomly throw a marble in, you're not likely to hit it. So improving the density or the cross-sectional area is an obvious way of getting things to hit. Now the other thing that we're interested in is velocity, that is the speed at which they hit. So if we can get that speed quick enough, it will overcome the Coulomb force and they'll hit. So really what this is saying is we've got enough of these things in a small enough area with a quick enough speed, they're going to hit. And that's a measure of the ability of this reaction to occur. Now, what's traditionally been used to increase the velocity, because that's what we're looking at really, is this. What's traditionally been used and is used in tokamaks is heat. Because if we heat something, we give it energy. And if we give it energy, it's going to move quicker. So if we heat something an awful lot, it's going to move very, very quickly. So what they're doing when they heat something up in a tokamak is they're actually improving the velocity. Now, heating something to get it to move quicker is actually not the best way of doing things. There are other ways of getting things to move, getting these particles to move quickly enough so that you can increase the chance of the fusion occurring. And of course, particles of this type have charge. So if I take a charged particle and I put it next to a plate like that, and I put a voltage on that plate, then that particle will be attracted to the plate. And obviously the speed at which the particle will be charging up towards that plate is going to be related to the voltage that I put on the plate. Now, another way of looking at heat as a motion isn't to do with temperature itself. We're not talking about temperature here, we're talking about velocity. And we can think about electron volts. Now, an electron volt is the speed of an electron at 1 volt towards a charged plate. And electron volts relate to temperature, and it's about 11,600 kelvins times 1 electron volt equal, 11,600 times 1 electron volts equals kelvins. So something like your television screen worked out that way. If you're sitting in front of a CRT television screen, those electrons hitting that screen at something like 200 million kelvins because of the speed at which they're travelling. So this idea of millions of degrees of Kelvin, if expressed in terms of speed of the particle and electron volts, is actually very, very achievable. It's quite low actually, and we can get that kind of temperature if we put on something like 4,200 kilovolts. We put something like that onto that plate, that particle will move with a speed of an equivalent heat of 200 million degrees Kelvin. So we can get that particle temperature right up there, actually relatively simply, just by putting on a plate and charging it to a voltage. Now, this is not something that has escaped people. This is something that was actually looked at by a guy called Philo T. Farnsworth. And Farnsworth was an American inventor, actually worked in television. And he was using something called a diode, a valve diode. Now, valve diodes are actually astonishingly interesting things. What you have is a tube that you create a vacuum in. You have one charged plate here, one charged plate there. And if you heat that plate, then it will give off electrons. And it will give them off only in one way. They can't go this way, they only go that way. So the current flow is only in one direction, hence it's a diode. Now that's a very interesting structure because what's happening in there is what we want to happen. And Farnsworth was looking at this and working with this. And he noticed there's kind of like a strange blue glow in these tubes when he was working with them. And he developed that from there into something called a multipactor, and from there into something called a fuser. Now, the fuser is a way of speeding up the particle velocity to a fusion velocity. And it's a very simple thing, really. All you actually do is if you have an outside bit and an inside bit, the outside bit you make positive, and the inside bit you make negative. And if you fire an ion in there, and that voltage is sufficient, so we're talking about a voltage difference between these two, around about 50,000 kilovolts, something like that. You fire those in there, what will happen is that a positively charged ion will be attracted to here, and very, very quickly. Now, of course, it will speed its way into the centre, and it's so fast that what it will actually do is speed back out again, But as it speeds back out, it's approaching a positive charge, it loses its speed and goes back down into the centre and recirculates in the centre there. So because it's captured here and is spending its time circulating in there, then there's a greater likelihood of a collision actually occurring if we're firing these things from lots of different directions. And that's what Farnsworth originally did. He looked at those. Now, this idea here, where we've got this large negative charge to attract positive, creates something called a potential well. The potential well is where you have a kind of concentration of voltage, like that. The particle comes into the well, and it's got enough energy it can roll up and then back down again. And it sits in the bottom of this well and is trapped. And because it's trapped there and you're still firing them in, then the density of this actually increases, which is, if you think about it, one of the things that we want to happen. We've got a cross-sectional area here, the density is increasing, the speed is a sufficient speed if we make that well deep enough. So if we make the well like that, obviously, the speed is going to be an awful lot less than if we make the well like that. So if we make this well deep enough, then that speed is sufficient. So he was actually getting fusion in this thing, and of course he was quite surprised by that. Now, the fusion he was getting, because of various limits on the machine, wasn't actually that great. And he handed this problem over to another guy, a couple of guys, that was three of them actually, and they looked at the problem and thought, hang on a second, what's happening here? Well, this stuff is physically coming into this well, but in order to do that, he's having to pass a grid. In order to make this thing happen, what Farnsworth did was construct a wire grid. So the wire grid was at the centre, the shell was on the outside, plus minus. The electron would come in, and about 2% of them would hit the grid. And once, the ion would come in. Once it hit the grid, they were lost. They were lost as heat energy to the grid, and this grid would get really, really hot, actually very quickly. 2% is enough. 2% is enough to actually melt that grid after a few seconds of running it, and it's enough to make sure that any reaction energy that's actually produced by it isn't sufficient to claim nuclear fusion. So this grid problem was actually a real problem for him. It's what really prevented this device from working, and it's called an inertial electrostatic confinement device. So the problem was how to get rid of this grid. And that was worked on by these guys that I was on about, Tuck, Wilson, Meeks, and what they did was turn this the other way around. So instead of having a negative charge in here to attract the ions to it, they put a positive charge. So we had a central grid with a positive charge, an outer grid with a negative charge, and then an encasement around that. So what you do then is put in your nuclear fuel, in this case it's deuterium, you put in the deuterium, the high negative charge strips it off to create positive ions, and the high positive charge here attracts the electrons, as you would expect. So the electrons are attracted into the centre. Now, electrons are tremendously easier to control in magnetic fields than ions because they're thousands of times lighter. So it's easy to deflect them, it's easy to control them, it's easy to contain them. I mean, easy is in relative terms, of course, because you're talking about very high temperatures here, very high energies. So this idea of being easy is relative, okay? But it's still much, much easier to control electrons than it is to control ions. And what happens is you build up a charge density of electrons in the centre here. Now, once that electron density charge has been created, what it does is create something called a virtual cathode. And this virtual environment here then attracts the ions that we've produced on the outside of it, so they shoot into the centre. Now, you'd think that the ions shooting into the centre of here, they would be zipping past electrons, so they pick up the electrons and they would be re-neutralised. Actually, that isn't what happens. Oddly enough, what happens is the ions zip into the centre, and of course they're moving so fast that they come back out a little bit, and then back in and back out, and they form a centre surrounded by this negative charge. So you have a shell of negative with a centre of positive. So we get this moving shell of and electrons kicking around here. And in the centre, we have a highly dense population of ions sitting in the centre there, that just sit in the centre. The overall is neutral, but the distribution of it is negative positive. And because these are now contained in there, and they're in a high density, high velocity environment, they will fuse. And they do. This works. This has been proven to work time and time again. But the problem with it, again, is this grid. This grid is always the big bugbear, because it absorbs sufficient energy, sufficient particles to stop this from actually tipping over a break-even point, that is, producing more energy out than it takes to do it. So there's a point at which this won't actually work because of the grids. So what you're looking to do now is create something that either has no grid or has a grid that, in this case, the electrons can't hit. And there's been some ingenious ways of doing this. And the first guy really to look at this, and now only going about 3 or 4 years ago, the first guy to look at this was Bussard, Robert Bussard, of the space engine fame. And what he did was he created something called the polywell. And the polywell was a ring of magnets. And these magnets, when they attracted the electron, because they were magnetically aligned themselves, the electron wouldn't hit them. It would go past them into the centre and be caught in the same way as the fuser. But in this case, the grid doesn't get hit, so there is no loss. Now, you have lots of problems in creating this magnetic field and containing the electrons in the centre. And he's up to, actually he passed away in 2007, but the group that he created is actually up to something called WB7, and WB7 is reported to reach the break-even point. It's now being run by, I think it's the American Navy who've taken this off, and they're running it. And he reckons for $200 million he'd be able to get this to work. Now, $200 million sounds a lot to us, but actually in tokamak research terms, it's peanuts. It's small change. It's what you'd find in your pocket if you had the kind of budget that tokamak research has had. So it's very, very small. And that's one real approach that's actually moving towards working. Now, it's not the approach I'm going to recommend, or the approach that I'm thinking about, because I have a slightly different view of it. Because what Bussard did really was essentially combine tokamak technology with IEC technology. And that's no surprise, because he came from a tokamak background, and the thing that he developed was called the rigatron. The rigatron is a variation of the tokamak. In order to work and work safely, tokamaks actually need to be surrounded by a lithium blanket, and it's about 2 meters thick, this thing. And the reason they do that is because the high energy particles that are given off by a tokamak are absorbed by the lithium. The lithium actually reacts with them to form tritium, and that tritium is fed back in, so it needs a huge hot lithium blanket around it. And the magnets were originally placed outside of the lithium blanket. The rigatron places the magnets inside the lithium blanket, and then you get a much better reaction result from that. So what Bussard did was take that same idea of this rigatron magnet arrangement and place it inside the IEC containment device instead of inside a tokamak, and he got a great deal of success with it. But the problem really is to do with these grids, getting rid of these grids. Now, whenever I hit a problem and I think, that's where we've got to, you have two choices. Either you can continue down the line that people are going, in which case you're going to hit the same problems they are, and hopefully you think you might overcome those problems, so you can take a few steps back and look at where the divergence occurred. And normally where the divergence occurred is another possible divergent point. It's something that you can branch off onto and have a look that nobody else is actually looking at, and it could well be an answer to what you're looking at. And this is what I was thinking when I was looking at this. So I went back to Farnsworth's multipactor, which is where all this stuff came from. Now, a multipactor is an electron cascade device, and it's actually problematic for microwave engineers because they try to get rid of multipaction because it interferes with signals. But essentially, if you have a plate like this, and you fire electrons off at another plate, if you do that with sufficient energy, and that plate material is the right kind of material, what will happen is that the electron will be fired back off, but the energy of the impact will fire off more electrons. So you get an electron cascade, you get more than one electron coming off from hitting this plate with a high energy electron. And if you can find that in a magnetic field, so you force those electrons to move in a straight line, and instead of going off that way, they're then bent by the field, and they go back towards this plate, hit this plate, they then fire off more electrons. And you get this increase of electron density. Now there's a number of ways you can do that. You can do that, as I say, with an electromagnetic field, a magnetic field, electrostatic field. Lots of ways you can do that. But by far the simplest way is just to use parabolic mirrors. So if you construct one of two parabolic mirrors like that, you fire the electrode off. Because it's a parabolic mirror, it comes straight back here and straight back there. Each time it's hitting those mirrors, generating more electrons and generating this cascade effect. And this cascade effect will build up an enormous amount of electrons within this device very, very rapidly. In fact, it's so rapid that when Farnsworth was running the thing, it actually started to shake his lab and glow bright blue, and he had to shut it down. And he dug, in order to run these experiments, he dug a well, and I think this well was something like 30 feet deep, and he dropped this thing down this well and flipped it on, and when the building shaking got so bad, he turned it back off again and analysed his data. So he was constructing these kind of things. Now, there are a number of interesting things to note about this. So incidentally, this thing is always done in a vacuum, so it would be contained in a vacuum tube. There's a number of interesting things to note about this. One is, it's a purely physical system. The other is, the electron flight time is a specific. It takes time for that electron to move across that distance. And obviously, if the distance is d and the speed of the electron is s, then the time it takes is a product of s and d. Distance divided by speed. If we can first of all have this situation where we're generating our electrons using these parabolic mirrors, and outside of this device we put a couple of magnets. Now let's leave those for a minute, and we'll talk about those in a minute. Okay? So we turn the device on, and we have a positive and a negative, and we bounce the electron that way. When the electron has reached this plate, then we reverse them. So we make that a positive, that a negative. The electrons bounce back this way, and they hit the plates, and they do that at the speed at which they travel. And we match the switching speed to the speed of travel of the electron, which is a fairly trivial exercise to do. Well, what happens if we increase that switching speed so that it's faster than the speed at which the electron can travel? Well, obviously, what will happen is the electron won't get all the way there. What will happen is it'll begin its journey, so it's speeding its way through there, and then we swap the speed. We swap the charge, rather. Make that positive, that minus. That electron will take that amount of time to slow down, because of course it's got a specific speed. It won't just stop. It'll take that amount of time to slow down, and then it will turn around and go that way and reverse itself. Again, if before it hits that plate, if we do that with it, so we change the charge on it, that electron will be forced to go like that. So you're going to get a situation where we have a two-fold approach. The first fold, to generate the electron cloud, we run it in cascade or multifaction mode, and that will generate a high electron cloud. Once we've generated our electron cloud, what we then do is increase the speed of the switching, so that electron cloud doesn't have anywhere to go. It just bounces in and out between these two. And as it bounces in and out between these two, what it's going to do is form an electron cloud in the center of our multifaction device. And the reason these are here is we can contain the sideways expansion of that using these magnetic fields, and they're just electromagnets. So the expansion this way is controlled by the switching speed of the two places at which we generated it. The expansion this way, and this is a ring structure, the expansion this way is controlled by this electromagnet that we put around the thing. And that will keep us an electron cloud in the center there. And what we've got there is exactly what we were trying to produce with the fuser, but it's completely gridless. So there are no grids to interfere. Now, if we put a tiny hole in there, and we fire ions into there using an ion accelerator, and wouldn't have to be much. You're talking about a cathode ray tube, an ion tube. You just heat something up, it will give off ions, and because of the high negative charge here, these ions are going to be attracted, because what we've done here is created that energy well. So they're going to be attracted to the centre in the same way, and you're going to build up a collection of ions in your virtual electrode here. And once we've done that, what we then do is pulse power this. So if we put a pulse of energy in there, that magnetic field will suddenly increase, and what that will do is squeeze this. So a bit like squeezing a rubber ball. You put in a huge field in here, you squeeze it. These things already have a high kinetic energy. They're in a small space. We squeeze them, then what we're going to do is increase the chance of diffusion occurring very, very dramatically. Now, that's the kind of device that I'm proposing. Now, the reason I'm proposing this device is it could be very small. It doesn't have to be big. In fact, there is a scale factor here where this will actually work better the smaller it is. So you're looking at something that's going to be about the size of an ordinary house light bulb. The power draw on it isn't going to be immensely massive, and the power out of it is obviously going to be greater than break even. We should get a lot of power out of that thing. So, what kind of material are we going to get out of there? Because we've been talking about nuclear fusion, we automatically think of nuclear products. Well, it very much depends what you put in there. Now, the reason they use deuterium an awful lot is because it's light. Because in the hot plasma schemes of things, you need it light, because if it's any heavier, the amount of energy needed to get it up to speed is just so high it becomes unapproachable. So they use the light ones, and they use the light ones because it's much easier to do it. But the unfortunate problem there, of course, is when you use the light ones, it's not only easy to do it, the reaction products are actually dangerous. But there is a very interesting product we can use. We can use boron. Boron 11 actually. Boron 11 is a stable isotope of boron, of which is about 80% of all boron is boron 11. And it's the main constitutive borax. It's about, I think, 0.005% of seawater is boron 11. So there's an awful lot of boron around. There's plenty of it. It's not a scarce mineral, scarce resource. And if we use that with the proton, so we have a proton-boron reaction. Proton, remember, is just a hydrogen nucleus. And we fire those into it, what we get is an agitated C12 carbon. That carbon is a high energy carbon, and it almost immediately splits into 3 alpha particles. One of them is a high energy alpha particle, and the other 2 are mixed energy alpha particles. That high energy alpha particle has a specific energy, a specific speed. Now, the good thing about alpha particles is they're actually relatively harmless. Oh, there is another slight mild product actually here, is we get some X-rays. So they get some X-ray production as well, but not a massive amount and quite easy to shield against. The bulk of the production is alpha particles. And these alpha particles are actually very interesting things, because as they speed out of the reaction, what we need to do is slow them down slightly with a magnetic field. And when they touch the side of the metal or the side walls of the container, which would make out of metal, when they touch the metal, then obviously they almost immediately absorb 2 electrons, and that creates a high voltage current flow. There is no use of steam here. We don't use a heat engine to extract this energy. Once it hits the wall of the tube, and we make our tube out of metal, once it hits the wall of the tube, then the current is generated directly in the tube wall. Now, once it's got its electrons, what the alpha particle becomes is a low energy helium. And that helium produced is not radioactive. So the reaction products of this proton-boron reaction are in fact just helium and a small amount of X-rays. Those X-rays obviously we'd use that to shield against, but it's not a massive amount. You're talking about a thickness of aluminium foil would actually do it. So if you got the thickness of aluminium foil but in lead and wrapped it around that, it would take care of your X-rays. This stuff would just be vented off as helium, so if you don't mind talking about Donald Duck for a little bit, then it's perfectly harmless. So as long as we use this proton-boron reaction, incidentally lithium is a very similar reaction and actually produces harmless products, then what we're doing is producing a hell of a lot of nothing, really, just energy, clean, free energy. And we don't have the same problems that we have with the nuclear fusion that's currently run and nuclear fission as we have our plants running at the moment. We don't produce tons and tons of radioactive waste. So that's what I'm actually thinking of building. Now, as I say, it's been an interest of mine off and on for quite a while. It's one of those things where I've been developing the project really and doing it alongside other things, which always slows you down. What I think is that I wouldn't be able to develop this project all by myself. I just don't think it's possible. I think the project is far bigger than me, really. And what I think is that if people got together and worked on this project, then we have a perfectly feasible methodology for creating a fusion reactor that would be the size of a light bulb, could sit in your kitchen quite safely, and generate free energy for your household. No problem at all. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the idea. I hope it sparked something off in you. And if you feel like talking to me about it and maybe becoming involved in setting up a project where we can actually build this thing and get it running, I'd be really excited and interested to hear from you. So I hope you enjoyed watching. Thank you very much.